The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Weiner, Program Manager of Education and Practice at the Association of Schools and Programs of Public Health. Thank you for joining us for today's ASPPH Presents Student Services Spotlight webinar, supporting international grad students along the journey from Prospective to Alumni. Today's webinar will be 1 hour in length. We will begin with a short introduction of our presenters, followed by the presentation, and we'll leave time at the end for questions. This webinar is part of the 2017 ASPPH Presents monthly series, and it is being recorded. The recording, along with the presentation slides, will be made available on the ASPPH website in the archived webinar section soon. Additionally, this webinar has been approved for 1 hour of CPH continuing education credit. While you are in listen-only mode and your lines have been muted, we encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation by using the question box. We will address your questions at the end of the presentation. We are pleased to have with us today our speakers, Hannah Nicole, who is Assistant Director of International Student Affairs and ESL for the Rollins School of Public Health at Emory University, develops and implements programs and ESL support for international MPH students. Although she holds an American passport, Hannah was raised in Nigeria and has spent most of her life outside the U.S. She completed an MED in Higher Education and Student Affairs at the University of South Carolina in 2010, then moved to Macau on a Fulbright English teaching assistantship. From there, she taught college students in Hong Kong for 4 years before joining Emory. Hannah's decade of experience in the higher education sector includes teaching, living, traveling, and presenting in nearly 50 countries. Along with seeing the world, Hannah loves to cook, eat, grow, and talk about food. Me too, Hannah, me too. Our second presenter is Rick Huizinga, a 10-year international educator. Rick currently serves as the program coordinator for international student life at Emory University. Previous to this role, Rick served as head teacher for a university program in Seoul, South Korea, and also as ESL director for a private high school in Southern California. He is a graduate of Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and received his master's degree from the University of Jyväskylä in Finland, where he spent 2 years as an international student himself. He is also a certified cultural intelligence trainer and thoroughly enjoys helping students, staff, and faculty become more effective in intercultural environments. Thank you both for being here today, and I'm going to hand the reins over to you.
Great. Thank you. Happy to be here. So I'm going to talk first about some of the resources that we provide for our students at the Rollins School of Public Health here in Atlanta. So I'll give you a little intro to the School of Public Health and resources specifically tailored to our international student community. So we have over 200 international MPH students and over 40 countries represented. Last I checked, it was 43. And that makes up 15 to 20% of our overall student population. This year, our incoming class made up 20%. We had 131 new international students, which is, we're growing every year. Here are a few class of 2018 stats. And before students arrive on campus, we start communicating with them through our admitted student portal. So all admitted students, domestic and international, can log in here. Before students arrive, we do a couple of webinars for students. So along with emails from me with information about housing or tips for preparing to move to the States, I'll chat with students through webinars. And in these webinars, I usually have a panel of current international students. So we do one in the spring called What's It Like to Be an International Student at Rollins? This particular webinar was designed right after Trump's travel ban came out to sort of just address that issue and that concern in for our prospective international students. And then closer to the start of the semester, we do a Coming to America webinar with packing tips and more specific information. When students arrive at Rollins, their first experience is a Rollins International Orientation. So that's a 3-day event where we invite speakers from across campus, including Rick, who today, from Office of International Student Life. We also hear from Campus Safety, International Student Services, the Counseling Center, and other offices and organizations that I'll talk about in a moment. International students at Rollins have access to the same resources that the undergrads do. So there's an International Student and Scholar Services Office that takes care of visa immigration paperwork. Office of LGBT Life, CAPS is our counseling center. We've got PE centers, the Duck where Rick works, student activities. And then here at Rollins, we have some resources for international and domestic students. So our Student Services Office is housed right here at Rollins. Our Office of Career Development for Rollins students is housed right here at Rollins. And we also have a prayer and meditation room and an ablution room that a lot of our Muslim or Arabic students take advantage of here at Rollins. Cafe and kitchen and so on. So international students are encouraged to get involved on campus as part of the transition process and to gain leadership experience that American employers tend to value. So something that I've heard from a lot of our international students is that finding jobs can be challenging for a number of reasons, visas and so on, and that getting involved on campus really helps students to network, have something to put on their resume or their CV as they're applying for jobs. And so these organizations provide leadership opportunities for students who might be interested in becoming part of the larger international student community or becoming more plugged in. So this year we're actually chartering the Rollins International Student Association for international students who want to plan events for their international student community. We have a mentorship program which partners a first-year incoming international student with a second year, and then a global peer network which connects domestic students with international students. We have a huge returned Peace Corps volunteer community here at Rollins, and so a lot of those Peace Corps returnees are excited about connecting with international students whose experiences might somehow parallel what they just experienced overseas. And the last two, the Office of International Student Life, Rick's office actually hosts International Coffee Hour, Global Lounge, and other ways for grad students to connect with grad students in other schools. In terms of English language support, I'm sort of the one-woman office for ESL classes, for our writing center, and to coordinate some other language support services for students. So in the fall, students can take an ESL class that meets once a week. We have 2 sections, and about half of our international students are enrolled in those ESL classes based on country of origin and TOEFL and IELTS scores. So typically students who take ESL classes will be from countries where English is not a primary language. So countries like China, Japan, South Korea, several African countries. I think most of my students are from this semester. And that class meets for 3 hours a week. It's pass-fail. And it's meant to support their language development so that other classes are a bit less of a challenge, to reduce the burden of, functioning in a new linguistic context, which can be a big cognitive workload. So we also have a writing center that's open to everyone, all Rollins students. We have 3 tutors. 2 are typically PhD students from the English department, and 1 is a biostatistics tutor. Volunteer peer editors are fellow Rollins grad students who want to work with multilingual learners on their assignments, and just to give some peer-to-peer feedback about the more sort of detail-oriented aspects of writing. Conversation practice sessions sort of replace the ESL course in the spring, and for these sessions I have students come in small groups of typically 5 to 10, and we do a lot of discussion. We play some word association and discussion focused games, and it's just kind of a space for students to learn and practice language skills, and in an informal small group environment. Writing workshops I'll do, or our writing tutors will do throughout the semester, and those are typically open to all Rollins students and very well attended by our international students in particular. Oops, I've got that on there twice. So a lot of students do ask about, and I'm sure if you work with international students at your institutions, you hear a lot about employment opportunities. So that's something that we end up working with students a lot on, and the Rollins Earn and Learn program is not strictly for international students, but it is open to all of our Rollins students. I won't read you all these details, but basically students are hired as university employees and then are able to work with our partners outside of Emory, and it's a good incentive for the employers because they'll pay half of the student's salary, and Emory will cover the other half. So it's a good deal for the employers and for the students, because the employers get well-qualified grad student, and students get to complete a practicum or internship experience through this program and work directly in their field, in their area of interest. So more than 500 students are typically employed by various agencies. And first year F1 visa international students can apply for the Real Award in spring of their first year. In terms of an online presence, a social media presence, we direct students a lot to our Facebook pages. Our class of 2019 Facebook page, for example, is a way for international and domestic students to the entire cohort to connect. We also have a Facebook group particularly for international students, and this is where I post announcements about various events on campus or things to know about, or a happy holiday for holidays around the world. And it's also a way for our prospective students to connect with our current students. I know a lot of our incoming students will contact our current students with questions, and they'll find roommates this way. There's also international students at Emory, which I believe Rick manages, and some other groups where students can find roommates at Rollins and so on. I also manage this page, the International Students Programs and Services, and this explores some of the programs and resources that I just described to you. And a little more, our academic writing resources can be found here. This page also includes a link to sign up for an appointment with a writing tutor in our writing center. And I'd like you to think of any questions about anything that I just mentioned. And if you think of a question, go ahead and jot it down, or you can type it in the chat box on your right-hand side, and we'll go ahead and go through Rick's portion of the presentation, and we'll answer your questions at the very end. So feel free. That's what we're here for. My email address, if you would like to get in touch with me, hannah.nickel@emory.edu, and this is my office line. Great, thank you. And I will pass it along to Rick.
So apparently we have this high-tech webinar, and Hannah and I have decided to just share a laptop in one office. So that's why we keep looking back and forth, and we could have easily been in separate offices. We just prefer to do this together. We're going to change gears for a second. And I think a lot of your questions will probably be more practical, related to the things that Hannah just spoke about. But for our session, one thing, I've been at Emory for a year now, and one thing that we wanted to introduce to the community was, how do you change the mindset of an institution? How do you, because when we really talk about the trendy topic of internationalization these days, is how do you fully integrate students into a community? How do you make sure the service is as good as it can be when there's so many different cultural differences going on? We all work in very global institutions, and how do we have a mindset that matches both for staff and also for faculty, and really for students, whether that's kind of home or US-based students or international students. So we rolled out kind of this training, you know, called a regimen. It's different workshops. Some can be as long as a full day. Others are just an hour. And some of these are more quick, like orientation sessions. But really what I want to do is go through how I approach these topics, what do I teach to people, and give you just a few highlights just of what we do. Now this is really the bones of everything. Please understand that the practical anecdotes, the research, and all the details will follow this framework. We just don't have time to get into it today, because we want to leave plenty of time with questions, because you're here for a reason, listening to us, and we want to make sure that those questions are answered, quite frankly. So we'll get into it with some highlights, but I think we first always have to cover the question of why. Why these really highly, they're kind of general, right? It's theoretical in a lot of ways, but like I said, it's also very practical in how we deal with culture. But why do we do this? And I think the first reason is that I've been teaching or working with international students in different countries for over 10 years. And one thing that has always stayed the same, no matter where I am, is the questions you will get from staff. I think if you work with international students primarily, you'll become sort of a resource, sort of a cultural middle person. So we do this, the first answer why is to be a resource for staff, faculty, and students. And along with that is the second reason, is really to get ahead of questions. Questions are going to happen. They always do when you have culturally varied learners in a classroom or in a community. Those questions come up, and I think we have to figure out ways, and this is by no means perfect, I admit that, we have to get ahead of these questions. Because when we don't, too many places that I've seen, it's a trial and error process in how you work with international students. And I feel like in kind of the 20 years that the numbers have really boomed with international students, it's still largely trial and error. It's kind of these ad hoc strategies and policies we put together. But I think to talk about this and make it more standardized, we have to have an understanding of culture to do that. And so that's what we do. It's the second reason why, is to get ahead of these questions that always come up. The third one I actually said already when I introduced my portion of the session is, just like business, we all know education is globalized now. And with that, we need global mindsets. If we are really going to have students that are welcomed into a place, it's going to be staff and students, whether US based or international, that are both meeting in the middle, if you want to call it that way. I think too often we are approaching international students from a deficit model of thinking, that we expect them to bend all the way. And we also want students and staff on campus to also bend a little bit, but also more just have an awareness for kind of why we're bending and kind of meeting in the middle. And so it's really for that. Global institutions need global mindsets. And kind of the fourth one is we approach this not from diversity training so much as we do skill building, is we want people to be effective in intercultural environments. We want them to know the knowledge of how. A lot of you'll see what I go through is knowledge, cultural knowledge, but it's really so that we can change and adapt in situations so that we are interculturally effective. This is a skill building workshop, as I always like to call it, even though a significant portion is spent on knowledge because it's new for most folks that have been through at Emory. It's new. So now the next question of why is why peaches and coconuts? Maybe you saw that in the title. If I go back a couple slides and you saw this and you said, why the heck is it named peaches and coconuts? That's the idea. So when people are usually, students especially, but adults too, they will ask themselves the question immediately, why peaches and coconuts? And I did not anticipate this to have the reaction that it did, but most people actually remember peaches and coconuts long after they've heard me speak on campus. And really it's a way of introducing why culture matters. And just to run through this example quickly, and then we'll get to the other highlights. I always tell folks right at the beginning, is there are peach cultures and there are coconut cultures. I fully understood this when I spent 2 years in Finland. But you could say peach cultures are people from countries that on the outside are very sweet. People from these countries like small talk. They like to, in a way, they have better conversations with strangers than they do close family members or friends. And they're very sweet and they take pride in being hospitable. But on the inside of a peach is kind of, there's a nut, right? There's something that's really hard you can't crack. In these cultures, typically people have a lot of acquaintances and lesser, deeper friendships. That's kind of a characteristic of peach cultures. And this you can kind of maybe say, because you can also ask the question, how are you in a peach culture? And some of you have spent time in other countries know that that's a strange question. And it is for a lot of our students. But we also have coconut cultures, where on the outside, it's crusty, right? You don't talk to each other in public, especially with people that you don't know. I know that when I lived in Finland, they have an expression that if somebody talks to you in public, you are either drunk or you're a foreigner, because a normal Finn would not do this. But this also explains, I think, countries from Northeast Asia, a lot of times, can fit in with this mold, because once you crack the kind of crusty outside, if you want to call it that, it's a much deeper relationship. People will ask more personal questions in a way, and relationships turn into more like family. It's deeper. Now both of these kind of comparisons, it's just culture, right? There's nothing wrong with either. This is how we grow up. But where I get interested in this on a college campus is how we perceive each other. So I usually at this point will ask, and it's really weird doing this on a webinar and not interacting with all of you. Yeah. But I'll ask them, what does a coconut say about a peach? And usually the answers are things like superficial, not authentic, fake even are the answers I get. And then I will ask, well, what do peaches say about coconuts? And then you get the obvious, well, they're rude, right? They're not friendly. And so I ask students and staff, and I say, why, if this is just culture, why are the impressions always negative? Why does that happen? And it's really to bring out some of these questions that I want to guide how we train stakeholders on our campus. Is it just culture that's affecting how we judge one another? I was just talking to another quick example, colleagues today who are upset at the type of emails they were getting from international students. They thought it was too direct, and they felt like it was rude in a sense. But I started asking questions, and largely this is either language or culture. The other question I'll ask, and I ask very honest, direct questions, is a simple cultural difference affecting how we work with each other? Are there misunderstandings that happen? And I think we are, and usually it's culture, right? It's the water we don't know we're swimming in. So we don't even realize how it's affecting our work. So we want to get them through trainings to understand this. And the last one is the one that particularly I'm interested in. And that is a simple cultural difference causing us to withdraw from one another. There's a theory in intercultural communication. It's called the anxiety uncertainty management theory. And I think it can explain some things what's going on campus, because with our students especially, we always hear the words awkward, right? Oh, awkward. I think when you are expecting someone to act a certain way and you don't get that, then we avoid each other and we withdraw from one another. And I think this can explain why sometimes you hear complaints of students staying in their separate groups, right? Usually you always hear, you blame Chinese students, for example. But you do hear it sometimes, and I always ask this question too. What about the US-based students? Are people staying in their cultural groups? And if they are, I don't think it's always purposeful. It's just we naturally withdraw from each other when culture is different, right? I think that's just kind of stating the obvious. We all know what's happening. So those are the questions I use. Now I'll just kind of highlight some of the major areas that we focus on. Large, I guess you want to call it theory, although not kind of more like models, I guess. One is cultural dimensions that many of you probably have already heard of. And I'll just give you one example of these dimensions instead of getting through all 6 or 7 that do exist. We've all heard of collectivism. And so I will explain that first of all in my workshops, and just say that collectivism is how you gain your sense of self. Your identity comes from the group that you are a part of, versus a lot of Western countries that are more individualistic. From birth, you are raised to be unique as an individual. But a lot of other countries, I just had a student from Haiti, and because the stereotype is it's always Northeast Asia, but I just had a student from Haiti, a student from West Africa, that their sense of self-worth comes from the group that they are a part of back home, whether that's family or society. But then what I want to get into is, how does a collectivist culture, in practical ways, does it come up in our campus? Sometimes this is for faculty wondering about classroom dynamics. Sometimes these are from students. One thing I will always hear from international students, particularly from certain countries, is the idea of self-promotion, right? In the States, we are masters of self-promotion. We love to talk about, and this is not a bad thing. This is culture. If we are looking for work, we talk about awards we've won. On our resumes, we're told to put, how have you solved problems? We talk it up. And networking can be really, really difficult, especially for students who see this as bragging, and how in their countries, this would be a negative, right? If you're in an interview, you wouldn't get the job if you were very self-promotive. But in the States, you do, right? And this is something that's tied to a collectivist versus individual culture. Concepts of relationships I spoke about already with kind of the peach and the coconut idea, as your group becomes very, very tight. Tighter than a group of acquaintances that you might typically get in US culture. Speaking up is the one that always, always, always will come up if you are teaching international students. And again, blame, I think, is often placed, but there's culture behind this. A lot of times we will have faculty and instructors saying, well, I told them at the beginning of class to speak up. And when that's part of a collectivist culture where you don't speak up, where there's an expression in Japanese where the nail that sticks up gets pounded down, it is totally against a person to speak up. And so it takes more than just telling them to speak up. There are strategies you can employ that unfortunately can't get into because of time. but that's probably the part you're all wanting. One thing is really just to talk to students, especially beforehand. Say, at this part of the conversation, I'm going to ask your input, and then students have a chance to prepare, and it reduces a certain amount of anxiety. So that's just one quick one. Saving face and how we give feedback across cultures. It plays into dynamics quite often, especially in student groups. Actually, students are more direct with each other. So that's just the dimensions part. Then I move on and I focus on how do we work with each other, right? How do we communicate with each other, and what are those differences? And I think the best work, there's been a lot of work done on this topic, intercultural communication. I think the most simple way and the best has been done by Erin Meyer and INSEAD. It's a business school in Paris. She wrote a book. It's titled The Culture Map. It's on there. I highly recommend it because it's a really quick read, actually. But these are scales you can work through. So you can see it on your screen. There's communicating. There's low context, which means you're pretty direct. There's high context, which means you avoid kind of insulting, and so you kind of skirt around the issue a little bit. Again, a Japanese expression is reading the air. And so you can scale on these where countries will lie, where cultural groups will lie on the scale. If you go low context, you're going to have Nordic Europe, German. My father's from the Netherlands. He's extremely direct. And then high context, which would be Korea, Japan especially. So you can always place it. In the US is somewhere towards the middle, but more low context. The US is also in the middle with evaluating and giving feedback. We have a feedback sandwich, right? Where we give something positive, then we give something negative, right? The real point we want to fix. And then we give something positive, so that person leaves. Direct feedback are, well, again, it's like my father who's Dutch. We'll just give really, really direct feedback. But they will do that. People who are from countries that are direct feedback won't have hard feelings about it as they take it. So me, as born and raised in the States, I take that feedback a little harder than if you're from the Netherlands. But then if you put a Dutch person in the room with someone from Korea, for example, who's on the opposite side of that scale. So I'm just illustrating how it's a scale, right? There can be anywhere on there. Leading is a way, it can be very hierarchical or egalitarian. Deciding is separate from that, and how top-down a culture can be, and there are cultures that are more top-down in decision-making. Then you go to consensual decision-making. If you go to Sweden, you will complain because people take such a long time to make decisions because they want everybody involved, right? Trusting. This is key with a lot of our international students and why they may not be seeking services. They come from very relationship-based cultures where you don't seek help unless you have a relationship with that person. And then you have task-based, like the States, where I trust you based on the work that you do. Disagreeing is another one. Avoid confrontation, confrontational. Again, these are all scales. And then scheduling. Scheduling can be flexible or linear, whether you're on time or not. The Swiss are very much on time. Flexible would be my Brazilian friends, right? But this can also be flexibility in terms of negotiation. So sometimes people from flexible time places will want to negotiate policies. And this can be very frustrating for someone from Germany who's more linear. I'm just like, no, policy is policy. So we'll go on. So then we move on to the third highlight. And this is where I want to emphasize the skill building part. We've talked about the differences with groups. So this has already gone on in our workshops for maybe a couple hours. And now we get into the next third to a half is cultural intelligence. And that is really building the skill. There are assessments and tests, even 360-degree ones that people can take in cultural intelligence. There's a copyright on the bottom, the Cultural Intelligence Center. You can contact them if you want more info. But this is our emphasis of skill building. So the question they asked when they came up with this model, was it 10, 15 years ago now, is who is successful? This always gets the students, especially at higher ed in the States. It gets attention of students, right? Because they're all about passing, being successful. So the research question was, who is successful in multicultural environments and who fails? It was a really direct research question. And their answer that they came up with after a lot of research was cultural intelligence. And in cultural intelligence, they found kind of 4 key characteristics of people who are effective in multicultural environments. And so if you take the assessments, they kind of measure you on each of these scales and even subtopics of each 4. So you start out, kind of top left is drive. This is one of the main reasons that I went to get certified in cultural intelligence versus something else like the IDI, is that it focuses on your motivation. And I said students are sometimes withdrawing from each other. What is the motivation of people to interact cross-culturally, right? We all know those people who are cultural seekers, but what about the ones who are not, right? And it's kind of nice in a way to train people in this. And if you want to be effective in work, if you want to be effective here, you have to have that motivation to do so. If I'm speaking to the business school, I'm really talking in very practical means. If I'm talking to a group of, let's say, Peace Corps volunteers, then I talk about very idealistic means. But we have to get at the motivation to interact cross-culturally so that you can be successful, because our world is obviously becoming more connected. So you have to have the motivation to also be more connected. Then we get into knowledge, which is kind of everything I just covered. I usually do also have a portion, I never did at the beginning, but then I added it about surface level cultural differences. To me, it was a little bit stating the obvious, but then I felt like we needed it because people would bring up things like language, right? And dress and music and kind of these more superficial things. So I added a more superficial part, kind of surface level, not superficial, but surface level cultural differences. And included that then with the last 2 things, the culture map that I spoke about. So then strategy is a person's ability to plan for encounters. If I'm going to dinner with my Syrian friends, I want to find out and make sure I'm not missing something obvious, like maybe the food needs to be halal that we're serving or that we're bringing. That's strategy, right? It's also your ability to be mindful. Like during this encounter, am I being like, is there a cultural difference at play here, right? Being mindful of that. And then action is our ability to bend, right? So we have French friends. Are we kissing on the cheek, right? Are we taking action on that knowledge? To give a really, really simple example, is it feedback? Are we giving feedback in our classrooms publicly, whether that's positive or negative? Or are we adjusting how we give feedback? That's CQ action. So these are the 4 areas where if you are successful in multicultural environments, this is what we want a campus to be. This is what we want students to be, staff to be, faculty to be. And again, I approach it from a point of skill building. I do not approach it in terms of you have to feel bad or guilty about this if you're not. This is really just improving our skills, right? Because we don't all have all these things. None of us do. None of us are perfect. And this is about how we're more set up for success in our jobs and our positions. And as a really, you can even look at this from a department. I've done this for individuals, but I've also done an evaluation for organizations as a whole, how their whole organization could be more culturally intelligent in a way. So really that's it. That's kind of the highlights of what I go through. I've been talking way too long, so we'll get at your questions. But just wanted to give you that kind of idea of kind of trying in a way to grow that mindset of people on our campus in the School of Public Health.
So if you've got questions, I don't see questions popping up yet, but please do feel free to ask. We've got some time left.
So Rick and Hannah, thank you so much. We do actually have a few questions. They come into a different box that you can't see. The first question for Rick, how many students and or faculty are typically in each of your workshops?
So this varies. I've done it as large as 300 and as small as like 7. I prefer the ones that are 7, quite honestly, because I'm an old high school teacher. I like to put people in groups and whatnot. And I need, part of this too is for departments to just start talking about their service to international students. I think there has to be some of that conversation inside of these. So when it's an hour, it's really hard to fit that in, to be quite honest, with all that kind of knowledge that I'm trying to get out. But yeah, so anywhere from 7 to 300 or so.
This next question I think is for Hannah. Can you provide some examples of employer partners for your REAL program? Is it the department?
Sure. We have a staff member who manages that entire program. But off the top of my head, I know we work with the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, and that's probably the most popular employer for our students in terms of desire to work with the CDC. I know a lot of international students come to Atlanta because of Rollins, but also in excitement about the close proximity to the CDC. So CDC, I think the Emory Healthcare Network and other public health related medical organizations that are in the Atlanta area. I hope that answers your question.
Great, thank you.
I'm happy to provide more information if you would like to shoot me an email. I could connect you with my colleague who manages REAL.
Great. And as a follow-up question for that, how competitive is the REAL program, and do a large number of international students take advantage of the opportunity?
That's a great question. The REAL program, as far as I know, this year the positions that are posted surpass the number of REAL applicants or awardees. So essentially, everyone who is granted the REAL award, and that's the majority of our students, will have a position that's available to them. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So this next question is for Rick. You had mentioned some resources that are available, but are there additional resources that you would recommend for people for communicating to people, say, from peach culture versus coconut cultures?
So resources, I'm not sure if you mean, this is why it's hard to do a webinar, right? I'm not sure if you mean in terms of books, articles, or even assessments. The authors that I usually point people to are Erin Meyer, who's on the slides. David Livermore has written a bunch of books about CQ. There are a bunch of others. Andy Molinsky. These are the ones that put it most simply that I use for, and I don't say that in kind of a patronizing way. I think we're all busy people. We just need the more simplistic readings, to be quite honest. So I point to those three authors the most. In terms of assessments, the ones that I'm only familiar with are the IDI and then the CQ test, the cultural intelligence tests. And that has a good way of, we don't always administer those tests because they cost money and not every department has the money for it. But we use them as a way of just kind of building awareness so that people either want to improve skills. The IDI I use less just because it's not as much, I think, about skill building. I think skill building is built in, but that's just my choice. It's what I was certified in too, so it's just I have more knowledge about CQ tests. But the IDI is used successfully in a lot of institutions, probably more so than CQ actually.
Thank you. This next question, I'm not sure if you all have the answer to it, but I'm going to put it out there. This person asks, how have you guided students to maintain their full-time status if they seem to want to take the MPH a little slower?
I think that's a question for you, probably.
Yeah, that's probably a question for me. Actually, it's a question for our Office of International Student and Scholar Services, because they do all of the visa and immigration related advising. I can tell you that students, international students, we don't have any international students who are enrolled below part-time if their visa status is alien temp, if they're categorized as alien temp. So we do have some international students who are in our executive MPH program, and that's an online program. And a lot of these students are, overseas, or we have one, for example, who is a physician here in the Emory Healthcare Network, but takes classes part-time, so he's employed. he's employed full-time and then taking classes part-time. So I don't know that we have a lot of students who don't complete the program within that 2-year period if they're not permanent residents, green card holders, or in the executive MPH program. That's a challenge.
This next question for Rick. Does Emory require students and or faculty to take an intercultural course or workshop? And then in follow-up, if it's not required, how many faculty or staff have actually taken some of your trainings?
Sure. So it is not required. It's not at that place yet. I would love it if it was, I guess. Although I worry about if you get people in the room that it's like why everybody hates diversity training in a way is because you're forced to take it. So I'd have my concerns, but I think you can build it in a way that people are happy with it when they leave. So we do not require it. So a lot of my job with this program has been coordinating with people that do offer trainings on campus. So for example, the one who was 300 or 350 people the other day, that was one of our key targets, was residence life on our campus, because quite honestly, they touch every international student that comes through at the undergraduate level. And it's a lot easier to get all of them in a room at the same time than it is faculty in the room at the same time. After that, it's voluntary. So when it's staff or faculty trainings, it's been anywhere from probably 15 people and upwards of about 50. And they're usually voluntary. I think some feedback we've gotten why people didn't go is because there's been a lot of workshops about international students already on our campus. And they're quite honestly sick of them. And so that's another reason why we really focus on the skill building part. And that's how we market it, is so that people can say, oh yeah, I have to be successful in multicultural environments. So that's why kind of when I presented too, it's a lot about that skill building piece, is because it motivates people to come. So hopefully that answered your question as well as I can.
I can add to that if that's all right.
Yeah, go for it.
So I can tell you a little bit about what we do or have done here at Rollins. Because I think, Rick's presentation is so fantastic. We've invited him to speak to our student leadership team, and that includes our student services team, our career development team, and our academic advisors, who are called ADAPs here at Rollins. And that's our monthly team meeting. So technically it was kind of mandatory for our student leadership team, who are sort of on the front lines in working with students. We also, I know Rick was there as well, we reached out to our community advisory board, which includes a lot of employers and other stakeholders who will hire or mentor our international students at Rollins. And I gave a presentation that gave a bit of a snapshot of our international student body and featured a few of our individual students, and Rick did his peaches and coconuts training, right?
Yeah.
And what we heard in that workshop was that there was a need and a desire for these types of trainings among our community advisory board members. I'll send out tips for faculty members. Faculty members can be challenging to get to really do any. Nothing can really be mandatory for faculty members, as far as I know. But I'll send out sometimes email tips for faculty on working with international students in the classroom. So I just sent out a tip that addressed something that Rick brought up earlier, that a lot of faculty will say students don't speak up in the classroom enough. And I'll give a suggestion, like during the discussion portion of the class, international students can sometimes get lost. So it might be beneficial to provide some structure to that portion, to repeat questions, to be aware of idiomatic expressions or monocultural concepts, and so on. Record lectures. So there is some attempt to I want to say, educate or create some awareness among staff and faculty going on at Rollins.
Great. I think that's really helpful that there are opportunities outside the formal trainings. And then thinking about those specific skills and maybe drilling down a little bit, do you have tips or recommendations for getting those students who fall on the relationship-based side of the trust scale to engage and seek out student services within your school or college?
Wow.
Well, that's a really good question. So we can go for
really
another
good
half
question.
hour.
Yeah.
So so I don't miss anything, can you read that question one more time?
Sure. So for those students from cultures that fall on the relationship-based side of the trust scale, what tips would you recommend for getting those students to engage and seek out student services within your school or college?
Yeah, so I think students will be more relationship driven, but obviously that requires a relationship, right? So what's that first push? And these are different based on the office, right? If this is something that has some stigma attached to it, like counseling and psychological services on our campus, it's constant outreach and constant knowledge building, because I think if you're going to shift someone's thinking a little bit, because these are students who are twice as likely to have rates of loneliness, anxiety, and depression when you're moving to a different country to study. So it's a way of kind of shifting that culture a little bit, that it's okay, that they constantly hear the message of that department or that office. With other departments, I'm thinking specifically of one person who's an advisor to international students, an academic advisor. Everybody knows this person because he creates a good relationship with the first person who comes in his office. And word of mouth spreads tremendously fast with international students. So the key is doing everything you can with those first couple that might walk in your door. And obviously we should be doing this with every student that comes in, right? But if you can help international students in a very tangible and practical way. Students here are from other countries because there's something tangible that they want, whether that's a job, and to get a job you have to be successful academically. If you can help them understand that what you are offering can help them be successful academically first, that's really going to help. And that's when the word of mouth is going to spread. So I know that's a pretty vague answer, but I think those principles have to come first. And then after that, once you have them in your office, then it's about building that relationship. I usually tell our staff particularly to take a little extra time with international students. I remember, so this is going off, I know, on a tangent, but I'll quick get this in. There was a former military officer at one of the trainings I did at Rollins, actually. And he was at one point responsible for training officers in the Jordanian army. And he and his fellow officers would get very upset in these meetings because before they could get to training plans, battle plans, whatever they were discussing, they had to sit and have tea for 45 minutes first of an hour-long meeting. And then after 45 minutes, then they could finally get the 15 minutes to actually talk about stuff, right? And this is really what it means to be from these relationship cultures, is that time has to be spent. And I know that's a lot to ask, but if we really want to be effective with these students, that time has to be taken. So yeah, I'll just leave it at that before I go way off even more. But that's the principles that kind of govern how we approach it with services.
That's great advice.
Yeah, thank you. That's certainly very valuable advice. This next question, I guess probably for either of you, maybe more geared towards Hannah. Are there services or activities that are the most popular among international students? And then does it vary or differ by country of origin?
I'll let you talk, because you can talk about just like School of Public Health.
Sure. Yeah. Well, of course, free food is always a plus. I didn't have to tell you that. So our Thanksgiving potluck was a huge success last year. Students were asked to bring, so my office collaborated with the Rollins Student Government Association to provide a turkey and mashed potatoes and some other traditional foods. But students were also asked to bring a dish, a traditional Thanksgiving dish if you're domestic, and a traditional dish from your own cultural context if you're international. And that was probably one of our most successful events, kind of this food and sharing of cultures and meeting each other. It was the first time that the partners, the domestic student and the international student partners, were meeting each other.
And I can give one too if you want.
Sure.
Keep going on.
Yeah. Do you want to give another example?
So for us, the way we really approach activities is community building, right? We want a community, a supportive community, because we're always looking at the friendship networks, which can predict student satisfaction. And so you want friends from your same country you come from. That's important. You want friends that are also international students because you're going through the same acculturation process. That's important. And we want students to be interacting with the US home-based students. Because that's important. These are all desired by students. And so we take it from a community building aspect. And I think if you do that, the key is it's regular. So the events that we have that are weekly, monthly, or bi-weekly, whatever that, there's a bunch of different programs we do. If it's regular and it builds community, that's when it's successful. So our international coffee hour, there's usually, I think the last was 125 people who just come to eat together. It used to be a lot of information, and we switched that into just come and be, just relax. We're all busy, so just hang out for a bit. And so community building becomes the focus, and it's regular. We have a families group too, that the same people keep coming. It's pretty successful. A lot of people come. It's a lot of little kids running around, but that's really fun. But it's regular, and so anything that's regular, and it's proven its worth. Even last year with travel bans going on, it was because of these regular events, we knew who the Iranian students were. And so we knew right away who to talk to and how to reach out to them. It wasn't relationship less with just an email from ISSS. Because of these regular events, we knew who they were. And we knew how to help them, and we could offer them real personal support that they felt, both from an institution and from individuals that could help them. So whatever it is, if you can just make it regular. We have sponsors for meals and things, so there's a way to fund it that way too. But.
That's a great suggestion that I will be trying to implement this year as well, that regularity. I've also found that if something is immediately practical for students, that it tends to be popular. So our thesis writing workshops or writing workshops in general tend to be quite well attended. Anything that's career related or professional development related tends to also be quite well attended. And then, as Rick said, the community involvement aspect, we see a lot of enthusiasm about the Rollins International Student Association, for example. It's being chartered this year, and for 10 leadership positions, we've already had 16 applicants from our first year class. And I see that as a really positive thing, that students have only been here for a couple of weeks and are already applying to leadership roles because they see the value of it and desire the sense of community.
Wonderful. Thank you both. We're running up on 3 o'clock Eastern, so I want to thank you, Hannah and Rick, for taking the time to share your experiences, your valuable insight and advice with our participants today. I will make sure to include your contact information and follow-up emails so people can follow up directly with you if that's okay. If they have additional questions. Great.
Great.
In closing, and as a reminder, this webinar has been recorded and will be available on the ASPPH website in the archived webinar section in the next few days, and I'll send a follow-up email when that has been posted. The next webinar in our ASPPH Presents series will be next week about integrating advocacy into the undergraduate curriculum, and additional webinars can be found on our events page. And also, as a plug, the Undergraduate Public Health and Global Health Education Summit is taking place in March in conjunction with the ASPPH annual meeting. The call for abstracts for the Undergraduate Summit is currently open. Thanks again, and have a great rest of your Wednesday.